Hi, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing some tips for painting white flowers. Now, I just want to preface this by saying there are lots of different ways to get white watercolor flowers. It really just depends on your personal preference and what flower you're painting. So some different ways to paint watercolor flowers, white watercolor flowers. You can just paint the shadows and use the white of your paper to act as the white in the flower. You can use masking fluid. You can use white gouache after you've painted your composition, then go over and paint white flowers with the white gouache. Or you can use white watercolor paint. Now, because it's such a personal preference thing, I'm going to show you how I prefer to paint. And I prefer to paint kind of a light wash and then paint the shadows in a darker color. So kind of using the white of the paper as my white. I never use white watercolor paint because it kind of has an opaque finish and I feel like it makes the flower look muddy, and that's not what I'm going for when I'm painting white flowers. So here are a few tips. You'll also notice that I cleaned off my palette. I rinsed this off and kind of wiped it down so that it would be nice and clean. I did that because when you're painting white flowers, you want to keep your paint really pure and isolated from other colors, because any color that gets into that paint mixture that you're mixing will show up. So you want to keep that in mind. I also like to water down my paint. I'm not just going to use like a pink, I'm going to use pink with a lot of water mixed in to really get it very, very light. And I'll paint flowers in just a second. But you also want to keep in mind what colors are kind of going into your composition. So in this particular case, I'm going to be painting kind of reds and greens and white. So I'm going to kind of use this creamy pink color for my white. But if you were painting other cool colors, you might want to water down a blue or a green to act as your really light white. The thing that you really want to keep in mind is to use more water than you think you should to keep that really, really light and soft. And then I'll show you the last little tip in a second. So I'm starting out with this really, really light wash. I used shell pink, which is already a pretty light color, and then I just added a ton of water into it. And to do that, I just rinsed out my brush and then I just dripped the water right into where I mixed that paint on my palette and just mixed that in. To avoid painting a puddle, I'm just going to tap out my brush. The color will stay in the brush, but the puddle will not stay in your brush. You don't want to paint a puddle. Now, when I paint this, it's not going to look like much of anything, just because of how bright the video is and the lighting. I'm painting some ranunculus. Now, I might darken this up just for the sake of this video so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going in there and just painting a really, really light wash so I can see where things are going. And then once it's dry, I can go in and paint a darker shade where the shadows are going to go. Okay, so the last tip is you want to paint defining shapes next to the flowers. If I just painted this and called it done, it wouldn't really look like much of anything. So I'm going to paint some stems and leaves and other flowers next to these so that these really stand out. Now I'm going to be careful not to touch any of my paint right next to it while it's still wet, because that green or that red will just seep right into this water. And I want to keep those nice and white. So this color is Deep Scarlet, and then Quinacridone Rose. I'm gonna mix those two together. Let's see. Now you'll be able to tell if your paint is still wet by just lightly moving it side to side and kind of looking at it at an angle. I can see that these flowers are still on the shiny side, so that's how I know that they're still wet. Over here I'm mixing sap green and perylene green. They're probably the two I reach for the most. I'm also going to mix in a little bit of undersea green. Now I'm ending right before I hit that flower, because I really don't want that green to mix into my white. This color is Hooker's Green. And I'm going to mix just a little bit of cadmium yellow. Or sorry, this is Turner's yellow. Sometimes it's hard to keep all of them straight. Turner's yellow, and then a little bit of yellow ochre. And then some water to lighten it up. I want kind of a nice bright green. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for now. And I'm going to go back to this color. I'm just going to add a little bit of that shell pink back into this color. But I don't want these to look pink, so I'm actually going to add in a little bit of this green, just a tiny bit, to kind of mute that down a little bit. If I add too much green, it'll look brown. In fact, I think I added a little bit too much. Add a little more pink back in. Err on the side of going too light. You can always add more layers later, it's harder to go lighter after you've already put down your paint. So now I'm going to pay attention to where some of my shadows are to kind of define this white flower. I know for sure I need a shadow down here to kind of define that edge. I also need one down here. Now, like I said, you'll need to use a different method depending on what you're painting. There are tons of ways to go about painting white flowers and tons of colors to use. So don't take this as the only way to do it. This is just one way, and one way that I really like to do it because I find it to be really easy. So I'm just adding some of those darker shadows in here. Now once this is dry, I could take it a step further and darken even a little bit more. In fact, I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use a slightly darker color, but notice I'm using the color that I already mixed as my base. That's to keep things just really cohesive and coordinated here. I'm going to tap in some of that darker color. Now I don't want to go too crazy because I don't want this to look like a pink flower. I want it to look like a white flower. And I am painting it a little bit darker just for the video so that you can see what I'm doing. But I don't want to paint too many of those details because then it will defeat the purpose of painting a white flower. I'm going to add a few dark details here just for a little contrast. Using that same green, I just added a little bit of Payne's gray. And my leaves are still a little too wet. Okay, now really quick, this is what you do if for some reason this happens to you. I'm grabbing my paper towel and it's still wet, so I can still save it. I'm just going to press down, not rub or anything like that. I'm just going to press kind of hard into that paint and just wait for it to dry. I'm not going to mess with it, not going to try and paint over it or anything until it's totally dry. And then I can go over with this kind of shadowed pink color right there. These are all a little bit too wet, so I'm just gonna wait a minute before I try adding the detail lines. But I am going to use some of this raw umber violet. Love this color. Just to add a few little sprigs. I'm just going to use a really, really light version of this green. because sometimes if it's a really soft color like this, I like the color to blend together. I feel like that just helps them look like they belong. Okay, maybe I'm going a little leaf crazy, but we're gonna call this good. And then once this is totally dry, I can go back and add my details, darken that up if I wanted to add even another defining layer, because some of these have kind of blended together. But I don't want to go too crazy because I don't want it to look blush or pink. But that is the basic gist for painting, or how I paint white flowers. If you have a favorite way of painting white flowers, will you tell me down in the comments below, as well as any other questions you might have for a future video. Thanks again for watching. Bye!